November 9th, 1944, 8:42 in the morning. The study at 10 Downing Street held the kind of silence that comes before storms. Leather-bound books lined the walls floor to ceiling. A fire crackled in the hearth, fighting against the November cold that seeped through London's ancient stones. The room smelled of tobacco, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of a city still recovering from the previous night's air raid sirens. Winston Churchill sat in his favoured chair, a fortress of burgundy leather worn smooth by years of use. At 69 years old, his body carried the weight of 5 years of total war. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his jowls sagged with exhaustion. But those eyes, those pale blue eyes that had stared down Hitler across the Channel, remained sharp as winter ice. He had begun this ritual 50 years ago as a young journalist. Every morning, without fail, he consumed the newspapers like a general studying battlefield reports. 5 of them lay spread across his desk: the Times, the Daily Telegraph, the Manchester Guardian, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express. His thick fingers, stained yellow from countless cigars, turned the pages with practiced efficiency. He read quickly, his lips sometimes moving slightly, a habit from childhood that had never quite left him. The morning light through the tall windows caught the smoke from his cigar, creating lazy spirals in the air. Page 1, page 2, page 3. Then he stopped. His hand froze mid-turn. The cigar in his mouth went still. For a long moment, Winston Churchill simply stared at the headline before him. Montgomery's brilliant strategy opens Antwerp. The article sprawled across 2 full columns, 15 paragraphs. The journalist had interviewed Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery extensively, it seemed. Quote after quote praised his meticulous planning, his bold operational vision, his masterful coordination of forces. The piece described how Montgomery's 21st Army Group had successfully cleared the Scheldt estuary in what the writer called one of the most tactically sophisticated operations of the entire European campaign. British forces featured prominently. The article mentioned the 3rd British Infantry Division. It referenced British artillery support. It discussed Montgomery's headquarters staff and their brilliant coordination. Churchill read through all 15 paragraphs. Not once, not in a single sentence did the word Canada appear. He set the newspaper down, not with anger, not yet, with the kind of deliberate, exaggerated gentleness that his staff had learned over 5 long years of war meant he was absolutely furious. The paper made no sound as it touched the desk. He placed it down as carefully as a man handling nitroglycerin. For 30 seconds, he sat motionless. The fire popped. Outside, London began its morning routine. Footsteps echoed in the hallway beyond his door. But in that study, Winston Churchill sat in perfect stillness, his mind working with the terrible precision of a man who had just discovered something unforgivable. He reached forward and pressed the call button on his desk. 3 short rings, the signal for his private secretary. 30 seconds later, the door opened. John Colville entered, 29 years old, efficient, discreet, carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. He had served Churchill since 1940, through the darkest days of the Blitz, through the desperate summers when invasion seemed certain. He knew the Prime Minister's moods the way a sailor knows the sea, and he knew the moment he saw Churchill's face that this was going to be a very difficult day. "Good morning, Prime Minister." Churchill did not return the greeting. He simply pointed at the newspaper with one thick finger. "Read that article, the one about Antwerp." Colville picked up the Times, found the piece, began reading. Churchill watched him, studying his secretary's face like a poker player reading tells. He saw the moment Colville understood, a slight widening of the eyes, a pause in his reading, a quick glance up at Churchill, then back down to the paper. Colville finished reading. He set the paper down carefully, unconsciously mimicking Churchill's own gesture. "I see," he said quietly. "Do you?" Churchill's voice remained soft, dangerously soft. "Tell me what you see." The article gives the impression that the Scheldt operation was primarily a British achievement under Field Marshal Montgomery's direct command. And what does it not say? It does not mention Canadian forces. Not once, not even in passing. Churchill leaned forward. "Get me the operational reports from the Scheldt campaign. All of them, every single one. I want them from the War Office within the hour. I want to know exactly which forces did the fighting. I want to know which commanders planned the operations. I want casualty figures." "Yes, Prime Minister." And John, after you've retrieved those reports, arrange a telephone connection to Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters. I will be speaking with him this afternoon. 3:00, not a minute later. Colville understood what that meant. In Churchill's vocabulary, speaking with someone at a specific appointed time meant war. "I'll see to it immediately, sir." The door closed. Churchill sat alone again, but the quality of his solitude had changed. He was no longer reading. He was thinking, planning, preparing for battle. Because Winston Churchill understood something that the journalist who wrote that article did not. Wars were not won by individual generals. They were won by alliances, by coalitions of nations that chose, by their own sovereign will, to stand together against tyranny. And those alliances were fragile things, held together not by legal contracts, but by respect. Canada had been at war since September 1939, before the United States, before the Soviet Union. From the very beginning, when Hitler's armies rolled into Poland, Canada had said, "We will fight." From a population of just 11 million people, Canada had mobilized over 1 million men and women. They had crossed an ocean to fight in a war that posed no direct threat to Canadian soil. 45,000 Canadians had already died in this war, and now some British journalist, with Montgomery's apparent blessing, was erasing them from history. Churchill walked to the window. Below, London carried on. Double-decker buses navigated streets still marked by bomb craters. Workers in cloth caps hurried to factories. Women in overcoats queued outside shops, ration books in hand. But would the alliance survive? That was the real question. The telephone on Churchill's desk rang. He turned and picked up the receiver. "Yes." "Prime Minister, this is Vincent Massey." The Canadian High Commissioner's voice carried the careful neutrality of a diplomat walking into a minefield. "Vincent, I was planning to call you. I suspect I know why. The morning papers." "You've seen it then?" "I've seen it, and I've already received 3 telephone calls from Ottawa. The opposition has the article. They're preparing questions for Parliament. This is going to be very difficult for Prime Minister King." Churchill closed his eyes briefly. "Tell me the temperature in Ottawa." There was a pause. When Massey spoke again, his diplomatic veneer had cracked slightly. "Prime Minister, there are serious calls for withdrawal, not from the fringe, from mainstream members of Parliament. They're saying Canada has given enough, that we've paid our share in blood, that if Britain doesn't value our contribution, perhaps we should bring our boys home." "How serious?" "Serious enough that King asked me to reach out to you personally. He's fighting to hold the line, but he needs help. He needs visible recognition of Canadian sacrifices. Soon." Churchill gripped the receiver tighter. "He'll have it. I give you my word, by this evening, this situation will be addressed." "Thank you, Prime Minister." "Vincent, one more thing. If Canada were to pull out now, what would that mean for the war effort?" Another pause. Massey was a careful man, not given to exaggeration, which made his answer all the more devastating. "We have 500,000 personnel deployed across all theatres. nearly 25% of Allied strength in Western Europe. Without Canadian forces, your offensive into Germany would have to be postponed. Possibly for a year, maybe longer. Churchill felt the weight of that settle into his chest. A year, another year of war, another year of V2 rockets falling on London, another year of concentration camps operating in Poland, all because one vain field marshal couldn't share credit. Thank you, Vincent. Give my regards to Mackenzie. Tell him help is coming. He hung up and stood there, hand still resting on the telephone. The door opened. Colville returned, struggling under the weight of a large box filled with folders. The operational reports, Prime Minister. 247 pages. Put them on the desk, then leave me. I'll need 2 hours. Your 10:30 meeting. Cancel it. Cancel everything until 3 o'clock. I am not to be disturbed unless Hitler himself surrenders. Colville withdrew. Churchill sat down and opened the first folder. For the next 90 minutes, Winston Churchill read. He read operational orders, after-action reports, casualty lists, tactical assessments from battalion commanders who had fought in the freezing waters of the Scheldt estuary, engineering reports about bridging flooded terrain, medical reports from field hospitals overwhelmed with wounded, and with every page his anger grew, cold, calculated fury. He took notes in red pen. Page 34. 2nd Canadian Division, 89% of assault forces at Breskins. Page 67. British involvement, 3rd Infantry Division, artillery support only, 287 personnel. Page 103. Planning meetings, Simons and Crerar, 47 tactical sessions. Montgomery attendance, 2 sessions only. The picture became clearer with every document. The Scheldt campaign had been a nightmare. The estuary was a landscape designed by the devil himself for maximum killing efficiency. Flooded polders, fortified islands, determined German defenders who knew that losing the Scheldt meant losing Antwerp, which meant losing the war. Into this hell, Montgomery had sent the Canadians, almost exclusively the Canadians. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division had assaulted the Breskins pocket. They had fought through flooded terrain, through fortified towns, through bunker complexes. They had taken the objectives. They had paid the price. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had cleared South Beveland. 12 days of continuous combat, house-to-house fighting in medieval towns. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division had supported on both flanks. Their Sherman tanks had somehow navigated terrain that military theory said was impassable for armour. Canadian engineers had solved the impossible technical problems. How do you build bridges across flooded land? How do you bring artillery forward when roads are underwater? How do you supply troops when everything has to move by amphibious vehicle? The Canadians had figured it out. They had done it. They had opened the Scheldt. Churchill found the final casualty report. He read it twice. Total casualties, Scheldt campaign, 6,367 Canadian personnel. Killed, 1,809. Wounded, 4,558. British casualties, 314. He sat back in his chair. 6,000 Canadian casualties. 6,000 young men killed or maimed in one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire war. Men who had crossed an ocean to fight for freedom. Men whose country had no obligation to be in this war at all. And Montgomery was taking credit for their sacrifice. Churchill looked at the clock. 2:45. 15 minutes until his telephone call. He stood and walked to his private bathroom. He washed his face with cold water, studying himself in the mirror. An old man looked back, tired, heavy, but his eyes burned with purpose. He returned to his desk and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey. He lit a fresh cigar. He arranged the operational reports in specific order, the most damning statistics easily accessible. At 2:55, Colville knocked and entered. "The connection to Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters is ready, Prime Minister." "Give me 1 minute." Colville withdrew. Churchill sat in silence, the telephone before him. He thought about what he was about to do. Montgomery was Britain's most successful field commander. Brilliant, difficult, arrogant, but undeniably effective. This conversation could damage their relationship, could create friction at a critical moment. But Churchill had learned something over 5 years of leading Britain through its darkest hour. He had learned that principle mattered, that how you treated your allies mattered, that wars were won not just on battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of the people who chose to fight them. Canada had chosen to fight. Canada had paid in blood. Canada deserved recognition. It was that simple. Churchill reached for the telephone. The line clicked and connected. "Prime Minister, good afternoon." Montgomery's voice came through, crisp and confident. Churchill did not return the pleasantry. "Field Marshal, I have been reading the morning newspapers with considerable interest and growing alarm." A pause. When Montgomery spoke again, his tone had shifted, more careful. "Oh?" "There is an extensive article about the Scheldt operation. It quotes you at length. It gives the distinct impression that this was primarily a British achievement under your brilliant command. The press does tend to simplify these matters, Prime Minister." "Indeed they do, which is why I have also been reading the actual operational reports, all 247 pages of them, and they tell a rather different story. Perhaps you can explain this discrepancy." Another pause, longer. Churchill could almost hear Montgomery's mind working. "Prime Minister, obviously the Canadians played an important role, but as overall commander of 21st Army Group, the strategic planning and coordination were my responsibility. I believe that's what the article was referring to." Churchill's grip on the telephone tightened. His voice remained calm, almost conversational, which anyone who knew him would recognize as a very bad sign. "Field Marshal, let me be very clear about what I have just read. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division conducted the assault on the Breskens Pocket. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division cleared South Beveland. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division supported operations on both flanks. Canadian engineers solved the technical problems of attacking across flooded terrain." He paused. "Canadian casualties exceeded 6,000 men. British involvement was marginal by comparison. This was not a case of Canadians playing an important role. This was a Canadian operation from start to finish." The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20. Churchill waited. When Montgomery finally spoke, his tone had shifted again, more defensive. "With respect, Prime Minister, the overall command structure and strategic framework were established by my headquarters. The Canadians executed the plan excellently, but the plan itself reflected my operational vision." Churchill had anticipated this. "I have here the planning documents. They show quite clearly that General Simons and General Crerar developed the tactical approaches for the specific assaults. Your headquarters provided general objectives and timelines, but the actual methods were developed by Canadian commanders who understood the terrain." He let that land. "You assigned the mission and then largely left them to solve the problems themselves. That is delegation, Field Marshal, not strategic brilliance." "Prime Minister, as Army Group Commander, I am responsible for all operations conducted by forces under my command. When those operations succeed, credit naturally flows upward. This is how military organizations function." And there it was. Churchill leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower, steel underneath every word. "Field Marshal, I am well aware of how military organizations function. I am also aware of how political considerations function, and you seem remarkably oblivious to the political damage you are causing." He stood, pacing. "Do you have any idea of the situation in Canada right now? Do you understand that Mackenzie King is fighting to maintain Canadian commitment against opposition that claims Canada is being used and abused by Britain? Do you comprehend that articles like this provide ammunition to those opponents? His voice rose slightly. They can point to a Canadian victory being claimed by a British commander as proof that Canada is not respected as an independent ally, as proof that Canadian soldiers are cannon fodder while British commanders take glory. He stopped pacing, stood perfectly still. Over 6,000 Canadian casualties, Field Marshal. I have the names, I have the units. And not one word about them in the newspapers, just paragraphs about your brilliant strategy. Silence. I was not aware of the political sensitivities in Canada. Montgomery's confidence was gone. My focus has been on military operations rather than public relations. Churchill's secretary, listening from across the room, would later describe the tone that entered the Prime Minister's voice at that moment as glacial. Then allow me to educate you on those political sensitivities, Field Marshal. He sat back down. Canada is not a British possession. It is an independent dominion that chose to enter this war by its own sovereign decision. Canadian troops serve under your command because the Canadian government agreed to it, not because you have inherent authority over them. Pause. That agreement depends entirely on Canadian confidence that their forces will be properly led and their achievements properly recognized. When you claim credit for victories won by Canadian blood, you undermine that confidence. You risk fracturing the alliance that is essential to winning this war. Montgomery tried to respond. Churchill cut him off. Let me make this absolutely clear. You will contact the British press immediately. You will issue a clarification. His voice became harder. You will state explicitly that the Scheldt operation was planned and executed by Canadian forces under Canadian command. You will name General Crerar and General Simons specifically. You will detail the Canadian casualties and tactical innovations. You will make it unmistakably clear that this was a Canadian victory in which you had a coordinating role but not an operational role. Pause. Is that understood? The line was silent. Churchill could hear Montgomery breathing. Finally, Montgomery spoke. His tone stripped of confidence, but Prime Minister, issuing such a clarification will make it appear I was trying to steal credit from the Canadians. It will be embarrassing for me personally, potentially damaging to my reputation. Churchill's response was immediate, sharp as a blade. Yes, it will be embarrassing. You have earned that embarrassment by your conduct. Your reputation will survive because you have genuine achievements, achievements that don't require you to appropriate the victories of others. He leaned forward. But if you do not issue this clarification immediately, I will do it for you. I will release a statement from 10 Downing Street correcting the record, and I will make sure everyone understands that the Prime Minister felt compelled to intervene because you refused to give proper credit to Allied forces. Pause. Which option would you prefer, Field Marshal? 20 seconds of silence. Then Montgomery's voice, quiet and defeated. I will issue the clarification today, Prime Minister. Good. I expect to see it in tomorrow's papers, all of them. You will. And Field Marshal, let me give you guidance for the future. The Canadian forces under your command are not British troops who happen to be stationed in Canada. They are sovereign forces contributed by an independent ally. They deserve the same respect you would give to American or Free French forces. Pause. Their victories are their own. You don't get to claim them just because they fought under your command structure. If you cannot understand and accept this, then perhaps we need to reconsider your command of army groups that include substantial Canadian forces. The threat was unmistakable. I understand, Prime Minister, it will not happen again. Churchill hung up without saying goodbye. He sat back, still angry, but satisfied he had made his point forcefully enough. He pressed the call button, Colville appeared. Draft a cable to Mackenzie King, personal and confidential. Tell him I have addressed the matter personally with Montgomery. Tell him Montgomery has been directed to issue proper acknowledgement of Canadian achievements. And tell him I personally want to express Britain's profound gratitude for Canadian sacrifices in the Scheldt campaign. Yes, Prime Minister. Send it within the hour. Direct cipher. I want King to have it before end of his working day. Colville left. Churchill walked to the window. The afternoon light was fading. London's November twilight came early. He thought about the Canadian casualties, about mothers in Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver opening telegrams with shaking hands, about fathers sitting in quiet rooms holding photographs of sons who would never come home. Those families deserved to know their sons had mattered. He stood at the window until the light failed completely. The following morning, November 10th, Churchill was back in his study at 8:30. The newspapers arrived like clockwork. He opened The Times first. There, page 3, a brief statement from Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters. Churchill read it carefully. 100 words, brief, clearly written under duress, but it said what needed to be said. Following recent press coverage of the Scheldt operations, Field Marshal Montgomery wishes to clarify that the campaign was conducted primarily by 1st Canadian Army under the command of General H.D.G. Crerar and Lieutenant General Guy Simons. Canadian forces bore the brunt of the fighting and casualties in extremely difficult conditions. The tactical planning and execution of assaults across flooded terrain reflected great credit on Canadian arms. The success of the operation was due to the courage and skill of Canadian soldiers, engineers, and commanders who overcame exceptional challenges to open the vital port of Antwerp. It was not generous, it was not fulsome. Montgomery's hurt pride showed in every word, but it was accurate. It corrected the record. It named the Canadian commanders. It acknowledged Canadian casualties. Churchill set down the paper and allowed himself a small smile. The Daily Telegraph had picked it up. So had the Manchester Guardian. By noon, every major newspaper in Britain would be running it. By evening, the wire services would carry it to Canada. At 10 o'clock, Colville brought the morning dispatches. Among them was a cable from Ottawa, personal cipher, from Mackenzie King. Churchill opened it. My dear Winston, I received your cable yesterday evening. I cannot adequately express my gratitude for your intervention. The clarification from Field Marshal Montgomery appeared in our morning papers. The opposition has been silenced, at least temporarily. You have done Canada a great service. The bond between our nations is strengthened by leaders who understand that respect and recognition matter as much as strategy and tactics. With deepest appreciation, Mackenzie. Churchill read it twice, then filed it carefully. He drafted a brief reply. My dear Mackenzie, it was the right thing to do. Canada's sacrifice in the Scheldt will not be forgotten. You have my word on that. Winston. The cable went out within the hour. In Canada, the newspapers ran Montgomery's clarification on their front pages. The Toronto Star, Churchill forces Montgomery to acknowledge Canadian heroes. The Montreal Gazette. Prime Minister intervenes on behalf of Scheldt veterans. The headlines told the story, not just of the campaign itself, but of something larger, about respect, about recognition, about a Prime Minister who had stood up for Canada when it mattered most. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mackenzie King stood in the House of Commons on November 13th and read Montgomery's clarification aloud. Then he read Churchill's personal cable. The opposition fell silent. Public opinion shifted almost overnight. Polling showed support for continuing the war effort jumped from 62% to 78%. Churchill had saved the alliance. But he knew this was not the end. Montgomery would comply with the letter of the directive. But his fundamental attitude would not change. Over the following weeks, reports filtered back. From British liaison officers, from Canadian commanders, from staff officers who witnessed Montgomery's interactions. The picture was troubling. Montgomery had issued the clarification, but in private his resentment festered. He treated Canadian commanders with barely concealed condescension. At planning meetings, he listened to Crerar's input with visible impatience, fingers drumming on the table. When Simons presented tactical assessments, Montgomery would nod curtly and move on. British officers noticed. Canadian officers certainly noticed. The atmosphere became strained. Lieutenant General Guy Simons later wrote in his journal, "The Field Marshal treats us with the patience one might extend to clever children who have accomplished something beyond their years. He congratulates us, certainly. But there is always an undertone, an implication that we succeeded because we followed his framework. The idea that Canadian commanders might have developed innovative solutions, this seems to wound his vanity." Churchill read Simons' reports with growing concern. He had won the immediate battle, but the deeper problem remained. The British military establishment, shaped by centuries of imperial tradition, still struggled to see Dominion forces as true equals. This was not unique to Montgomery. It pervaded the entire structure. British officers who had served in India, in Africa, brought those attitudes when commanding Canadian, Australian, or New Zealand troops. But this was 1944, not 1914. The world had changed. Canadian soldiers who crossed an ocean to fight fascism were not going to accept being treated as second-class participants. Churchill understood this. Which was why he spent so much energy managing these relationships, ensuring Canadian contributions were recognized. It was exhausting work, but it was essential, because the alternative was unthinkable. If Canada withdrew, even partially, the consequences would cascade. The entire Commonwealth structure might fracture. And without Commonwealth forces, Britain alone could not sustain the war effort. The mathematics were brutal. British manpower was exhausted. 5 years of war had drained the nation. The Canadians, Australians, South Africans, New Zealanders, these forces were not merely helpful, they were essential. Montgomery understood this intellectually. But understanding intellectually and feeling emotionally were different things. His pride, his vanity, his sense of himself as Britain's great military leader, these overwhelmed rational calculation. Churchill recognized this flaw, had recognized it for years. Montgomery was brilliant but difficult. In peacetime, such a man would be retired. But this was not peacetime. Britain needed Montgomery's tactical brilliance, even packaged with insufferable arrogance. So Churchill managed it, stepped in when necessary, protected the alliance by protecting the principles that held it together. In December 1944, Montgomery requested a private meeting. They met at Chequers on a cold afternoon when snow threatened. They sat in the library, fire burning. Montgomery, in his characteristic beret and trim uniform, sat stiffly. Churchill, in his burgundy dressing gown, poured them both whiskey. "You wanted to see me, Field Marshal?" Montgomery took the whiskey but did not drink. He turned the glass in his hands. "I wanted to discuss the Scheldt matter, to explain my perspective." Churchill said nothing, waited. "I did not intend to minimize Canadian contributions. I hope you understand that. My focus was on the operational level. The strategic framework. The journalist drew certain conclusions I had not intended." Churchill sipped his whiskey. His expression gave away nothing. "I issued the clarification as you requested. I have been more careful. But I wanted you to understand I bear no ill will toward the Canadians. They are fine soldiers. They executed the Scheldt operations with great skill." "But," Churchill prompted. "But?" "There is always a but in such speeches. I am waiting for yours." Montgomery set down his glass. "But as Army Group Commander, I cannot allow the chain of command to be publicly questioned. If my subordinates receive primary credit for operations conducted under my command, it undermines my authority." And there it was. Churchill set down his own glass, leaned forward, looked Montgomery directly in the eye. "Field Marshal, let me be very clear. The Canadians are not your subordinates in the sense you mean. They are allied forces operating under a unified command structure. That is fundamentally different. He stood, walked to the window. General Crerar does not answer to you the way a British divisional commander does. He answers to the Canadian government. His troops fight under your tactical command because the Canadian government agreed to that arrangement. But that agreement can be withdrawn at any time, for any reason. Churchill turned back. Do you understand what that means? It means you command Canadian forces by consent, by agreement, not by inherent authority. And that consent depends on those forces being treated with respect, being recognized for their achievements, being seen as partners, not tools. Montgomery's jaw tightened. Churchill could see the argument forming. But Montgomery was intelligent enough to recognize when he was on thin ice. I understand, Prime Minister. Do you? Do you truly? Churchill returned to his chair. Because I am not convinced you feel it in your bones. I do not think you have internalized what it means to command Allied forces in a coalition war. He drank. The Second World War is not the first, Field Marshal. The Empire is not what it was. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they are not colonies anymore. They are independent nations that chose to fight. And when this war ends, they will remember how they were treated. Montgomery stood, his face composed, but Churchill could see tension in his shoulders. I will be more mindful of these considerations in the future. See that you are, because next time I will not merely request a clarification, I will take more direct action. The threat hung between them. Montgomery nodded once, sharply, and left. Churchill sat alone, watching the fire burn down. He had won this battle too, but he felt no satisfaction, only weariness. The weariness of fighting the same battle repeatedly. Montgomery would be more careful, more guarded, but his fundamental attitudes would not change, and Churchill would have to keep managing it, keep intervening, keep protecting the alliance from the very commanders who were supposed to be defending it, because that was leadership, not the grand gestures, not the famous speeches, but the grinding daily work of holding things together. Outside, snow began to fall. Churchill watched it, thinking about Canadian soldiers still fighting, still dying in frozen fields. They deserved better than commanders who could not see their worth. Churchill had tried to be that leader, had fought that fight, would continue fighting it for as long as necessary, because some things mattered more than victory. Some things mattered more than strategy. Respect mattered. Recognition mattered. Honor mattered. And Winston Churchill would defend those principles with every tool at his disposal, even if it meant fighting his own commanders, even if it meant having the same difficult conversations over and over, even if it meant standing alone against the tide of imperial arrogance. Some battles were worth fighting. This was one of them. The years that followed proved Churchill right. When Canadian forces liberated the Netherlands in spring 1945, Churchill personally drafted the congratulatory message. He made sure it went out under his own name, prominently displayed. The courage and skill of Canadian forces in liberating the Netherlands has written a chapter of military history that will be remembered with gratitude for generations. The Dutch people owe their freedom to Canadian blood, and Britain owes the Canadians a debt that can never be fully repaid. He pushed for honours. General Crerar was appointed Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath. General Simons received the Distinguished Service Order. Canadian unit commanders received recognition far beyond normal expectations. Some British officers grumbled about favouritism. Churchill ignored them. He understood what they did not. That respect could not be faked. The work was exhausting. But Churchill never wavered, because he understood that how Britain treated its allies during the war would shape how those allies saw Britain after. And he was right. When the war ended in May 1945, Canada emerged with a newfound sense of national identity. The old colonial relationship with Britain had been fundamentally transformed. Canadians had proven themselves on battlefields across Europe. They had sacrificed enormously, and they had been recognized for it. Churchill's interventions had mattered. The story of how he had stood up to Montgomery became part of Canadian national mythology. It was told and retold. The core remained. When it mattered most, Churchill had defended Canadian honor. Montgomery, by contrast, became a figure of resentment in Canada. When his memoirs were published in 1958, Canadian veterans read them with mounting anger. Montgomery devoted exactly one paragraph to the Scheldt, one paragraph. He mentioned that Canadian forces had performed adequately in difficult conditions. He did not name Crerar or Simons. He did not mention the tactical innovations. He certainly did not mention the terrible cost in lives. Canadian military historians responded with detailed studies. They published accounts that ran to hundreds of pages. They interviewed survivors. They combed through operational records. They proved, beyond any doubt, that the Scheldt had been a Canadian victory, that Montgomery's role had been minimal, that his attempt to claim credit had been theft. These studies tarnished Montgomery's legacy in ways he never fully understood. In Britain, he remained a hero, but in Canada he was remembered as the general who tried to steal glory from the men who had actually earned it. The contrast between the two men's legacies became stark over time. The incident crystallized a fundamental truth about coalition warfare, about alliances between sovereign nations, about the difference between commanding subordinates and coordinating with allies. Military academies began teaching the Scheldt as a case study, not for its tactical innovations, though those were significant, but for its political dimensions, for what it revealed about the fragility of alliances. Canadian military colleges made the Scheldt central to their curriculum. Officers studied not just the battle, but the political aftermath. They analyzed Churchill's intervention. They examined how respect and recognition shaped alliance dynamics. The lessons spread beyond military circles. Historians examined how the war had changed relationships within the British Commonwealth, how Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa had emerged with fundamentally different self-conceptions. The Scheldt became a touchstone, a moment when the old and new orders collided, when imperial arrogance ran headlong into democratic sovereignty. In 1998, the Canadian government erected a statue of Winston Churchill in Ottawa. The dedication drew thousands. Veterans in their 70s and 80s came to pay tribute. They spoke about Churchill with genuine affection. One veteran said simply, "He understood we weren't colonials, we were allies. We had chosen to fight, and he made sure that choice was respected." Montgomery never received similar honor in Canada. No statues, no special dedications. His name appeared in history books. His tactical abilities were acknowledged, but he was not beloved. The British military establishment slowly learned the lessons Churchill had tried to teach. It took years, decades. Old attitudes died hard. But gradually the culture shifted. The idea that Dominion forces were independent allies rather than imperial subordinates took root because the alternative was complete dissolution of military cooperation. In 2007, something unexpected happened. The British government declassified documents from the war. Among them was a draft letter from Churchill's files, dated November the 9th, 1944, never sent. Addressed to the Secretary of State for War, it began, "I write to inform you that Field Marshal Montgomery has demonstrated unfitness to command Allied forces in a coalition environment. His recent conduct regarding recognition of Canadian contributions reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of the political dimensions of coalition warfare. I am therefore directing that contingency plans be prepared for his replacement should he fail to correct his behavior immediately." In Churchill's handwriting, signed, but never sent, because Montgomery had complied. But the letter revealed something important. Churchill had not been bluffing. When he threatened to reconsider Montgomery's command, he had meant it. He had been prepared to fire Britain's most successful field commander to protect the principle that allies deserved respect. The revelation caused a sensation. The draft letter became perhaps the most powerful symbol of Churchill's commitment to the alliance. It showed what he was willing to do in private, the costs he was willing to bear. In the final analysis, the story of the Scheldt was not really about a battle, it was about leadership, about understanding that military success required more than tactical brilliance. It required political wisdom, emotional intelligence. Montgomery had the tactical brilliance. He could read terrain, mass forces, coordinate complex operations. But he lacked the wisdom to understand that wars were won by alliances, and alliances survived on respect. Churchill understood this deeply. He understood that the Canadian casualties at Scheldt were not just statistics. They were sons and brothers and fathers, citizens of a sovereign nation that had chosen to cross an ocean and fight. And those men deserved to be remembered, deserved to have their sacrifices recognized, deserved to be written into history as the heroes they actually were. Churchill fought for that recognition, not because it was easy, not because it was politically convenient, but because it was right. Years later, historians would debate Churchill's legacy. They would examine his imperialism, his racial attitudes, his strategic mistakes. They would find much to criticize. But in Canada, one aspect of his legacy remained untarnished: his defense of Canadian honor, his insistence that Canadian sacrifices be recognized. On a spring morning in 1965, an old man sat in his study at Chartwell, his country home in Kent. Winston Churchill was 90 years old now, frail. His hands trembled as they held the morning newspaper. His eyesight was failing, but he still read the papers every morning. 50 years of habit could not be broken. The newspaper that morning carried news from Canada. A memorial had been dedicated in Ottawa to the soldiers of the Scheldt. 8,000 veterans had attended, men in their 70s and 80s, some in wheelchairs, some on canes, all wearing their medals with quiet pride. The article included a photograph. An old soldier standing before the memorial, his hand raised in salute. The caption identified him as one of the engineers who had built bridges under fire across the flooded approaches to Breskens. Churchill studied the photograph for a long moment. Then he set the paper down with the same deliberate gentleness he had used 21 years earlier on another November morning when he had read a very different article about the Scheldt. His secretary entered quietly. "Sir, you have visitors. Canadian High Commissioner and several veterans. They've come to pay their respects before—" He trailed off. Everyone knew Churchill did not have long. "Send them in." 3 old soldiers entered, moving slowly, carrying between them a framed photograph. They stood before Churchill's chair, uncertain, these men who had once waded through freezing water under machine gun fire. One of them spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Prime Minister, we wanted you to know, we wanted you to hear it from us. What you did in 1944, making Montgomery tell the truth, it mattered more than you know." Churchill's voice when he spoke was barely a whisper, but the steel was still there underneath. "You did the fighting. I merely ensured you got the credit." "That's not nothing, sir. That's everything." They presented the photograph, the memorial in Ottawa, inscribed at the bottom, "To Winston Churchill, who remembered us when others tried to forget. From the soldiers of Scheldt." Churchill took the frame with shaking hands, looked at it for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "I am very glad you know you were remembered." The veterans saluted. Churchill, with great effort, raised his hand to return it. After they left, he sat alone with the photograph, thinking about that telephone call 21 years ago, about Montgomery's reluctant compliance, about the cable from Mackenzie King, about all the small battles he had fought to protect something that mattered. He had fought many wars in his 90 years, against the Boers, against the Kaiser, against Hitler, against political opponents and economic crises and the thousand disasters that befell nations. But some of his most important fights had been like this one, not against enemies, but for principles, for the idea that respect mattered, that recognition mattered, that how you treated those who sacrificed for you revealed who you really were. He looked at the photograph one more time. Those old soldiers, those brave men who had crossed an ocean to fight tyranny, who had waded through hell for a cause they believed in, who had never forgotten the Prime Minister who fought for them. Churchill closed his eyes. The photograph rested in his lap. The spring sun streamed through the windows of Chartwell. 21 years ago, on a cold November morning, he had read a newspaper that made his blood boil. He had picked up a telephone and fought a battle that needed fighting. And now, at the end of his life, these men had come to tell him it had mattered. Some victories, he thought, are measured not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in the knowledge that you stood for something when it would have been easier to look away. He had stood, and they had remembered. That was enough. 3 weeks later, Winston Churchill died peacefully in his sleep. The Canadian government sent an official delegation to his funeral. But more importantly, 8,000 Canadian veterans contributed to send that wreath. From the soldiers of Scheldt, you remembered us. The wreath was placed at the front of Westminster Abbey, right beside those from the King, from Parliament, from all the nations of the world. But to the old men who had fought in the freezing waters of the Scheldt estuary in November 1944, their wreath meant something more. It meant the circle was complete. He had fought for them, they had honored him, the debt of recognition had been paid in full. And in the end, that was what leadership meant. Not the grand gestures, not the famous speeches, but the knowledge that when it mattered most, you had done the right thing, even when it was difficult, even when it was unpopular, even when it would have been easier to look away. Winston Churchill had not looked away, and history remembered him for it.